Hello, good afternoon and good morning. A warm virtual welcome to all of you that have logged on to our last Transatlantic Tuesday of 2020. This is our 12th edition. We started out the year meeting in person actually in our Berlin office and quickly switched to a digital format once the pandemic hit. Hopefully we'll be able to get back into a convening atmosphere again in 2021. But we're glad that you could join us today with our expert panel to talk about the female voters that played a role in the US election. And we're really happy to have two great speakers who could break down the categories, sort of this broad category of what a female voter is and offer their perspectives. Before I hand off to our moderator, Corinna Horst, I'd like to thank our Business Alliance for partners for making this Transatlantic Tuesday series possible, Bayer, Deloitte, Google, and Pfizer. And for those of you that don't know the game plan for Transatlantic Tuesday, we're going to start off with a moderated conversation for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then you'll be able to pose questions through the chat function. So please pose your questions through the chat function. Keep in mind that this session will be recorded. And again, before I hand over to my terrific colleague in Brussels, Corinna Horst, who's Deputy Director of GMF's Brussels office, I'd also like to give a heartfelt thank you to my colleague, Elizabeth Winter, who has been the brain trust of this Transatlantic Tuesday series throughout the year. So thank you, Elizabeth. Enjoy the conversation, and Corinna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sudha, for your warm welcome. Also a welcome on behalf of myself in Brussels. I'm delighted to be able to introduce our two speakers today. So one is Amanda Becker, a correspondent in Washington, D.C., who has been covering the U.S. Congress and U.S. politics for many years, as well as Raumesh Akbari, a state senator from the state of Tennessee, sort of a local politician, to two insiders into the political scenario in the U.S. Obviously, many of us, since the elections in November, we've been really focusing on the presidential level as well as what happened in US Congress. But today, I really would like to use the session to focus on US voters and really work out a little bit sort of what makes up US society and what do voters care about, that also help us maybe to sort of discover, have a better sense of what drives US domestic policy debates and what Europeans should keep in mind as sort of next year and then the following years of a Biden administration sort of has to face in terms of local sort of politics. So maybe as a start, just a few facts that really struck me. One was that we had an incredible voter turnout. So 2/3 of the eligible voters actually went to the ballot. We also noticed a very strong gender gap, and I come right back to it. And then the exit polls showed that there was still a rather large contingency of white women that voted for Trump, for President Trump. So I'm kind of curious to sort of learn a little bit what our speakers have to say to this. But maybe let's get started. And Raumesh, I would like to ask you, so it was not until the 1980s that a gender gap, so a difference between the proportions of women and men who supported a particular candidate, emerged in presidential elections. 1980 was also the first time where women voted at a higher rate, and that has continued. So I would love you to share with us a little bit, what got women to vote in 2020? What are the issues they cared for and got them to the ballot?
Well, certainly, I think there were a series of issues on the table. One, 2020 has been a year like no other. I think that there were some, and Donald Trump talked about this quite a bit during his campaigning, but his efforts to try and scare the white suburban voter into voting for him by highlighting issues of racial injustice and protesting. But I think that actually had a negative impact for him. We've seen that a lot of our suburban areas, one, especially in our bigger cities, you see a more educated voter who is just, quite frankly, the tricks of Donald Trump did not work. So scaring them, your suburbs will not be safe, that didn't work. I think his really lackluster, I don't even want to use the word, criminally negligent response to the COVID-19 crisis, not putting action in place that could have kind of got things, testing and contact tracing and all sorts of necessary things in place more quickly, downplaying the virus. I think that had a really negative impact on him. And then, of course, his bullying tactics. I just think people were sick of it. It was like, come on, man, enough is enough. It was a very clear, if you didn't support him, he was going to come after you on social media or in any other capacity, regardless of your service to his organization. So I think that it just kind of you had a more educated base in the suburbs. You had folks who just were sick of it, quite frankly, and were not going to vote for him in that way.
Thank you. Maybe Amanda, this is an opportunity to come and bring you in. You wrote an article about sort of the Republican Party, and it's also the high number of Republican women that were elected and will now enter the government. One of the things that really puzzles European is that so many women still voted for Trump despite the discriminated language, even the sexist language that they've worked. Now, moving forward, what do you think the impact will be that these Republican women inside the Congress have, but how does it also reflect sort of the 55% of white women that still voted for Trump? How do you see that dynamic sort of unfold?
Yeah, well, I think it's important just to frame the entire conversation that I don't think you can say a woman voter in the US and immediately know what kind of voter you're dealing with. You would have to break it down into a lot more subcategories. I mean, as you started out by saying, a greater percentage of our electorate is female, and they vote at higher rates than men. And depending on where they live and what ethnicity they are, and whether they're in an urban or a rural area, or their level of educational attainment, it can really run the gamut. So yeah, I mean, Clinton only won women by about the same as Biden did. And, this is all based off of exit polls, which can change as they start to get more information, especially in a year when so many people voted by mail. So this year, 57% of women overall voted for Biden, but 55% of white women, as you said, voted for Trump. And, for these women, as she was saying a minute ago, it was the reasons that they still voted for Trump had nothing to do with what he was doing intentionally to try and woo women with his talk about the suburbs and keeping them safe. I sat in on many panels of women, Republican women who had voted for Trump in 2016, but rated his performance as bad or very bad. They would either laugh when they would be asked questions about, does Donald Trump make you feel safer when he's talking like this? Do you trust him to make her safer? For these women, a lot of them, it was the economy. I mean, if you look at it, for people who thought the economy was going well for them, voters overall, including women, overwhelmingly voted for Trump. People who thought the economy needed some help voted for Biden. So, women like men and any other group are not a monolith. And it was really kind of an economic message that was resonating for them this year, for the ones who did vote for the president again. Now, as you said, there is a record number of Republicans coming to Congress next year. So there's a record number of women in the House overall, 117. Our previous record was 102, and that was just set last year. 89 of them are Democrats, and so they met their record, but didn't break a record this year, and 28 of them are Republicans. Now, they did beat their record. They only had 25 was the max they've ever had, and that was back in 2006. So, they are making gains, but part of the reason they jumped so much this year, the Republican women, is because their ranks had kind of been decimated. In 2018, when we saw this influx of Democratic women to the House, only one new Republican woman was elected. And a challenge for women in the Republican Party is that it's a party that doesn't like to talk about so-called identity politics or supporting you because of a part of your identity, including being a woman. So these women do not get historically do not get a lot of support especially in their primaries from the national party groups. And if they can't get through their primaries, they're never going to end up on the ballot. So I think that there has been some organizations on the Republican side. One was started by Representative Elise Stefanik in upstate New York to try and support these Republican women and kind of be the Republican counterweight to groups like Emily's List, which of course stands for Early Money is Like Yeast. It helps your political career if you get that funding early on in your primary or even before. So yeah, I think that as long as those groups continue to be taken seriously on the Republican side, we will probably still continue to see growth in the numbers of Republican women coming to the Hill. But as when we look at the electorate, they are not all going to govern the same way. Women are not going to, conservative women are not all of a sudden going to, be singing Kumbaya with Democratic women and, passing a bunch of things that, are historically surprising. But I do think there could be some more opportunities to work across the aisle.
Thank you. It's a wonderful way to sort of pick up. But before I give the mic again to Raumesh, I do want to encourage all of our listeners to send in their questions or comments that they have. Please use the chat function, and I will sort of review what is coming in and try to weave it in as we go. I mean, it's certainly something that I took away from, reading about the election and sort of afterwards, that we have an increasingly sort of very divided and almost sort of polarized sort of voter constituency. And Raumesh, I wanted to bring this back to you also on a local level. You're a member of the Democratic Party, but you're in a very Republican red state, as we know. Sort of looking at the electorate in Tennessee, I mean, obviously there's Nashville and Tennessee, Nashville and Memphis that was very blue, but the rural areas is very red. But then we also learned from Amanda at the moment, very, no voter group is very homogeneous. So you as a local politician, how do you try to cater to your very diverse constituency that you have?
Well, certainly Tennessee seems to be getting redder by the moment, and that really has to do with the thought process, the policies that have supported our current governor. As a Republican, our previous Republican governor was someone who is more pragmatic, more of a business-minded Republican. Now we have one who's pretty conservative and who signs on and supports legislation that is unconstitutional. We've had 3 bills that have come through that we know are unconstitutional. They've been challenged in the courts and have been overturned, which is a big change for Tennessee. Tennessee, among southern states, was usually one that was considered more pragmatic. We would alternate between Republican as governor and Democrat, regardless of if the Democrats were in charge or the Republicans. Our U.S. senators were considered those that were more centrist. Now that is not the case. In our last election, we had a conservative former governor, Democrat though, won all 95 counties when he was in office, and he lost to Marsha Blackburn, who is infamous for saying she was Donald Trump before Donald Trump existed. So we've had this significant shift to conservative politics that folks will vote for this Republican regardless of how well qualified they are. To me, it's disheartening. Obviously, it's difficult. I am one of 6 senators in the General Assembly of 33 that are Democrats. In the House, we have 25 Democrats out of 99. So we're in a super minority. We cannot pass legislation without Republican votes, and they can pass legislation without any of our votes. But for me, I try and focus on common things we agree on, right? So criminal justice reform is a big one that Republicans and Democrats seem to be able to find common ground on. Treating our drug epidemic as something that's a healthcare issue as opposed to a criminal issue is something we seem to agree on. Issues related to education and even sex trafficking, those are things that we can agree on. I try and stay in that lane. Otherwise, it's like we're not going to agree on so many things. Women's choice is something that they just don't think is important. And like I alluded to earlier, they passed an unconstitutional law which a bunch of states are doing that, hoping that it'll be bumped up to the Supreme Court. It's difficult, right? But I find that we're not 44% in the last statewide election, Democrats voted for so we're not as far away as it seems. It's just that we have a ways to go. And I'm hoping that our cities, like you said, Nashville, which has had significant and continued population growth, will be able to bring more folks in that are more diverse and are more Democratic leaning. We've kind of already seen that. We were able to flip a Senate seat. I'm the Senate caucus chair, and we were able to flip a Senate seat for the first time since 2006. So it's one seat, but it was a big impact for us. So I think that's what's going to continue. We have some other cities in East Tennessee that have had population growth that will help. However, we know in 2022, the Republicans are going to gerrymander our districts so that it makes it even harder for us to win. We're already kind of putting together a super team, I guess, of lawyers and a redistricting response team that will hopefully be able to help with that. But sometimes it's just that, and I think it's something that has kind of happened on a federal level and it's trickled down. It's so polarizing. It's so negative. It's so against the notion of let's work together. Let's make smart decisions based on policy as opposed to politics. Like, we don't have a statewide mask mandate in Tennessee. Our governor said even yesterday that he needs to see where we are in the process before he acknowledges Joe Biden as president. I mean, so that's some of the things we're dealing with. But it's playing to a small part of the population that's kind of controlling, the more conservative part that's kind of controlling the narrative, which I think is really unfortunate and anti-progress. It does not create any sort of progress that's meaningful for our state.
Make the same mistake. I need to unmute myself first. Thank you so much for also, giving us a sense of how one can address some of the policy issues, but from a different angle that might allow bipartisanship. I have a question from one of our listeners, and sort of to pick up on what you guys said earlier on about the economics also really having been sort of one of the driving subject matters for people to come out and vote. Entrepreneurs, so the question is sort of entrepreneurial women tend to prefer a libertarian agenda that, gives a smaller role to the state. But then liberal women are supportive of greater regulations. So how do you see that, I guess those very different approaches to how to fix the economy sort of playing out, more regulations, less regulations, and how do the parties will pick this up? And maybe, is there a way to collaborate on that? Raumesh, maybe you first again, and then I'll have Amanda chime in.
Well, I think we've kind of seen that even in our state, shutdowns for businesses related to the COVID-19 crisis. You have some folks who are like, no, let's open up, it's fine. And they do tend to lean more towards less government regulation, of course, unless they're talking about doctors' offices, and then we're not going to go there. But I think that the Democratic Party traditionally has more regulations when we're talking about the financial industry, the environmental industry. But I still think that we're pro entrepreneurs and provide additional resources for startups and really focus on a strong and robust SBA. So I think that the economy, it's not just about the business owners, it's about the folks who suddenly, like Tennessee is really a hospitality and tourist driven state. And all of a sudden now we have no real safety net. The maximum unemployment compensation is $270 per week, which is just not, and it's poverty wages. And then you see a federal government that's unable to actually create any sort of financial stimulus, a second round that could help folks. So I think it's more than just because, of course, a lot of folks who already were well off have continued to thrive in this environment. But I do think that the folks on Main Street, they're saying, hey, this economy is not working for me, as opposed to more so these large business owners or small business owners. So for me, that's the difference. Like, my husband lost his job. I lost my job. My kids can't get a job. Like, I think those are the conversations that people are having, and that's how they're looking and approaching the economy as opposed to, hey, I made this amount of money on my, I have stock in Amazon. And of course, anybody that did that or stock in Zoom, I mean, goodness gracious, if I could go back to January. But I think it's more of a Main Street as opposed to a Wall Street conversation, just in my experience.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think it is very important to sometimes bring out sort of what happens sort of locally, because the general newspapers sort of tend to focus on sort of the big business. Amanda, I also wanted to bring you in on, the sort of economic and sort of from the conversations you've had, the research you've done, where do you see, this sort of going? I mean, the economy was such an important factor in 2020, but then obviously there was the impact of COVID, and it's one of the listeners sort of asking that. So the concern about the economic future, how do you see sort of this being played out, and sort of what role do women's views, perspectives sort of play into this?
And I will apologize. They just started blowing leaves outside my condo. So if the audio is too bad, just wave and I'll go find a closet or something and try and talk from there. Well, I think it's important to remember, because the person who asked the question asked about libertarians, that in our two-party system, we essentially don't have a viable libertarian party on a national level. And where we're at now is, yes, the Democrats are the party of more regulation typically than the Republicans, especially on things like environmental regulations, workplace safety, stuff like that. They also have some problematic social elements to their party that are becoming increasingly problematic for business. So, when we saw the racial justice protests over the summer led by Black Lives Matter, you saw a lot of corporate leaders, frankly, on that front that were putting themselves, out in front on that in a way that certainly the Republican Party in our country was not. And so, we don't have a situation where kind of business owners and entrepreneurs neatly line up into the Republican Party over the Democratic Party based purely on a regulation standpoint, because there are a lot of other aspects to that political party that I think some business people would find problematic, especially in industries like tech and things like that. You actually have them skewing more Democratic in this country rather than Republican. So, a Biden administration probably will put in more regulations. A good example would be immediately they're going to reverse a lot of the stuff that the Interior Department has done to kind of open up oil excavation and fossil fuel exploration on public lands. So certainly, oil and gas companies won't be happy about that. But, because of the way our two-party system works and kind of the pairing of the social and the economic issues, our business leaders don't necessarily fall neatly into one category.
Thank you. I think it was also very puzzling for many of us in Europe to see the election outcome in Florida, who was obviously, President Biden won that state. At the same time, the state also passed a minimum wage of $15 an hour, which I think normally is not something that's being associated with the Republican Party. So I think, it's certainly something to watch, the balance of the two parties and the socioeconomic ones. I wanted to come back to another sort of population group in the United States, and that's the Latino population. And maybe not sort of specifically about the women in that group, but one of the things is obviously the majority of the Latino population voted for Biden, but we also saw high support for President Trump among Latino voters, both in Texas and in Florida. And so this goes back to one point that you made, Amanda, about we can no longer sort of see women as a homogeneous group. But I think here in Europe, we've also learned that the ethnic communities cannot also be seen as just one big economic, ethnic sort of homogeneous group. So curious, sort of, what do you make of that, and how do you see this sort of playing out in the future? Amanda, maybe I can ask you.
Some of it has to do with just ideology. I don't think that the Democratic Party can take Latinos or Latinas for granted. I think that there's the tendency for the Democratic Party to do that, to assume that higher turnout is always good for them. I think that this election showed that that's not necessarily the case. You know, higher turnout also meant a lot more turnout for President Donald Trump. Some of the border communities in Texas, I think, particularly surprised people to the extent that they voted for Trump. About 30% of women, Latinas, voted for Trump, and even more men. And you know, it's really specific to these voters. You know, for some people living on the border, the U.S.-Mexico border, you might think, you know, you're a relatively recent immigrant in terms of your family came here within the last couple of generations. You know, you might align more with, you know, quote unquote, liberal immigration stances, and certainly not some of Trump's policies. But also, you know, building a border wall and border enforcement are some of the best paying jobs in those areas of the country that don't have too many other economic drivers, you know, where people are driving across borders to do their shopping. And, you know, that might be a good, steady federal job or a job with a federal contractor that, you know, pays more than you could make, you know, doing a retail job or other things that are available in that area. So, you know, I think that that is something that the Democratic Party is going to have to put some effort into before the next election to fully understand all of those dynamics and why. And, you know, also, you know, Biden specifically, especially when I'm thinking of a place like Florida, frankly, just didn't have a very good turnout operation geared at Latino voters. And, you know, Cuban American voters are different than Puerto Rican voters who have moved to Florida. And, you know, all of those things need to be taken into account. So just like there is no one woman voter, there also is not one Latino voter.
Okay. I don't know, Raumesh, do you want to come in on this point about ethnicity or?
Well, I could certainly just jump in and echo. You're not looking at monolithic groups, and so there are different interests, and that's kind of how you have to fill in the gap. Also, anecdotally, I'm messing that word up, but anyway, there are folks who have gone through the legal immigration process who, to a certain extent, are very harsh towards those who are not, and they believe that there should be policies in place that are followed. And I myself have just been completely surprised by it, because I would think, you know, you understand the circumstances of that particular country, but it's more so like almost wanting to distance themselves and say, well, I did the legal process, you should do the same. So that's one thing. But I also think, again, just not a monolithic group. You look at the situation in Florida with the Cuban population in Miami, and that seems to be a population that is very hardcore Republican. And I think you can trace that back even to the 80s. And looking at the stances around bringing them to Florida, or allowing them to come to Florida, and then giving them certain economic opportunities for their families. So it's going to be something that we have to crack. And I think we also have to look at specific policies that address that population, and not just say, well, don't you see how awful he is and how he's talking about, he's saying, you know, all Latina folks are criminals. You know, I don't think that's enough. I think you have to say, look, this economy that he talks about, it's not as good as you think it is, or these regulations that he has in place, it's not actually good for our country or our future. But also a part of it, I think, that we haven't mentioned is faith-driven, especially around women's choice and also LGBTQ rights. And so I don't know that that's something, or I hope that's something the Democratic Party will never compromise on. So.
Yeah, it's a tall order, because I actually saw also that there is a high number of pro-life Republican women that entered Congress, so that might, with ethnic backgrounds, sort of a daughter of Cuban descent, actually also a Republican congressperson of Middle Eastern background. So I think we will see quite an interesting new diverse dynamic as it maybe these pro-life, pro-choice discussions might be popping up. Raumesh, I wanted to follow up and ask you Biden's campaign choice of Kamala Harris. How do you think has that sort of influenced voter turnout, enthusiasm? My assumption that it was pretty high among African American women. What about the African American men? Was that instrumental for getting Biden the win?
Well, I'll say this. I think that when Kamala Harris was selected, there was just such enthusiasm. I was actually in session, and I'm sitting on the Commerce Committee, and I'm the only woman and only person of color. And I get this news, and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. And it's a step forward, and it's something that you don't even realize just how excited you'll be until they make the announcement. Because we've been discussing all summer, well, who's he going to pick? These are the options, blah, blah, blah. But when he actually selected it, it was a validation, I think, of the hard work and the behind the scenes, support by Black women for the Democratic Party. Now, I'm a part of a group called Black Women United. We meet every Sunday, and it was created around the notion of the conversations they called Kamala Harris ambitious for wanting to be the vice presidential nominee. And it's a group of women, you have you have Donna Brazile, you have Star Jones, you have a bunch of folks who are kind of in the day-to-day of this process. And that was an issue we grappled with at the end. How do you engage the Black male voter, right? Because you had several rappers who would come out and say, oh, we support, like I think Lil Wayne, and you had Ice Cube having these conversations where they supported Donald Trump, which I think was really difficult. And they would say, well, Donald Trump's speaking directly to Black men and no other party's doing that. But I think it was also a falsehood, because Donald Trump speaking to Black men with his platinum plan was like 2 pages long, which was not specific or anything like that. So I think that's a challenge for the Democratic Party. How do we engage Black men in a way that's meaningful, where they feel it's a part of the process? Part of our concern was we could see through social media and just different polls that Black men were hesitant a little bit to support, or just a small portion of the population, but enough to make a difference, to support Senator Harris because she's a woman. We also saw in the election with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump that Black men were not supportive as much as Black women. And even if you look at Georgia with Stacey Abrams and Kemp running against each other, there was a percentage of Black men that voted for Kemp over Stacey Abrams, which could have made the difference. So I think that's something we have to figure out as a party, certainly. But it starts with engagement around specific issues, and it has to start now, not in an election year, in order to make that difference. I will say this, though, I think on the state and local level, you see Black men in positions that Black women have yet to be able to crack, from being mayor of the city I live in or in Congress. We have never elected a Black woman to Congress from the state of Tennessee. So I think maybe on a federal level, it's almost like a shift. Like all of a sudden, the Black men are feeling, because there wasn't this reaction, obviously, when Barack Obama was on the ticket. Everyone was like, yes, Barack Obama, say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud, we have to go support him. Plus, I mean, he was exceptionally qualified. But you've kind of seen this gender issue that has kind of emerged. And I think it's something that people are going to have to kind of go through and get used to. But there's also going to be specific outreach to try and pull this demographic in to say, hey, this is a party for everyone. I mean, look at the rich history of engagement with not Black women only, but also Black men, the entire Black community. But again, we're not a monolithic group, so that's where it gets complicated.
So just a very quick follow-up question. So what would be some of the policy issues that the Democratic Party could get African American Black men engaged in, or could be a pull?
I think a lot of the things that we heard was around economics and specific outreach to Black-owned businesses to help them get from, because a bunch of Black, particularly in Memphis, the majority of our Black-owned businesses have one employee, which is the owner. So giving those types of tools, I think issues around criminal justice reform, even though Biden is much more progressive and Senator Harris, they're much more progressive than the Trump administration, they still have past that they had to reckon with Senator Harris being a district attorney, with Joe Biden being part of the crew that kind of orchestrated or created the tough on crime bill. But that was the narrative during that time period. I mean, Republicans, Democrats, Black men, white women, all the above, everyone was in support of that. But I think that's what's going to have to happen. Resources, and obviously reviewing how Black men are being, or how men or people of color in general are being considered by the criminal justice system. I think that'll make a difference.
Okay, thank you. So before I ask, raise one of the questions that came through the chat function, I wanted to remind our listeners to do send in their questions. We still have about 6 minutes left, so I hope I can get a couple of more in. So one of our listeners sent a message: shouldn't the goal of a democratic, educated society be that all people vote on the issues, not because of their race or gender? So question to both of you: are we stuck in sort of identity politics, or can we transcend that? Amanda, maybe you want to go first?
Well, I think what we've been saying today is that because you can't treat these groups as a monolith for the most part, people are voting on the issues. Trump made inroads with Black men. So clearly there's something that he was talking about that appealed to them in a way that caused them to break with what is expected of them to a certain degree. Same with what we were discussing with Latino voters. And I'm glad she brought up choice issues in terms of abortion access, because for the Latinas, that's one of the big issues that drove them in terms of if they supported the president this year. So, I think people are voting on issues. Sometimes it's economic, sometimes it's abortion access, sometimes it is the environment. And that's why we are seeing patterns that, don't have every demographic falling neatly into a category.
Raumesh?
I would agree. I would agree totally. I think that there are issues that appeal to a certain demographic. I think that we have to focus on as well. But it's not a straight identity politics situation. I think it's more issue driven, and obviously there's been this continued discussion among Black women that the Democratic Party takes us for granted. So pushing certain issues or pushing certain positions of power within the party. So I don't think it's just identity driven, but more so having your seat at the table. Making sure that a party that you support truly reflects you, and you are visible in that situation. So that's what I'd say.
Thank you. My last question I want to throw out is, and it's related to the state of Georgia, since we are there facing sort of, we'll have a Senate race that's still open. As I was preparing for this, I was sort of reading on Georgia being actually one of the states with the highest population of Black voters who tend to vote Democratic, and most of the white are supporting Republicans. So I wanted to ask both of you sort of where you see this race going, and whether Raphael Warnock or Jon Ossoff, both of the candidates to maybe unseat the two Republican senators, one being a Black man, the other one being a young Jewish but white man. What are their chances? And sort of, I don't know if you have a crystal ball, what is your hunch how this is going to turn out?
Well, go ahead.
I was going to say the same thing, probably. I puzzle over this myself, and I will keep this short so you don't have to listen to the leaf blowers. But I think that Democrats have a chance of winning one, but not both, and possibly neither. So I think Republicans will still hold on to the Senate if I had to make control of the Senate, if I had to make a prediction, and they need to win at least one of those seats to do that. I think there's a couple factors to look for, and we don't know how it'll play out until people vote. We don't know if Trump voters will be as engaged to come out for a runoff when Trump himself is not on the ballot anymore, and Biden has won. But on the other hand, we don't know if Democrats are going to be as energized either. And also you have a dynamic in this country where swing state voters like divided government. they like checks and balances. So I could see people who take into account the fact that Biden won Georgia into the calculation when they're selecting their senators. But I would also point out that Democrats spent a massive amount of money on Senate races this year. And the two where they, I think, met expectations are Arizona and Georgia. And that is absolutely because of on-the-ground organizing that women and women of color have been doing for years in those states, and has much less to do with the actual specific races or who was on the ballot as president. It was the work by Stacey Abrams and other women in Georgia, and it was the work of Latina and Native American voters in Arizona.
Raumesh, please.
I would wholeheartedly agree with those points because you see in South Carolina where you had this massive amount of money raised for Jamie Harrison, and he still was not successful. Even looking across, I hate to be Sarah Palin, but I can see Mississippi from my window across the river. There are folks who are just, you have no ground game. Like, so Mike Espy got a significant amount of money, and they said, oh, the polls look good, he might be able to win the Senate seat, but no ground game, no real plan. So for Georgia, I hope hope upon hope, just because I know what not having control of the Senate is going to do to a Biden agenda. But I do agree, I think it's going to be a very heavy lift. I'm hoping that Trump's very negative comments around voting and the Georgia election process will kind of push the Republicans to kind of disengage and not want to support or vote. But I also know that traditionally communities of color have a real drop-off when it comes to coming back for runoff races, whether we're talking about state, local, or federal. So I do hope that we will be able to pick up at least one of those seats, but there's so much going on in Georgia right now, so much money, so much manpower. It's really hard to tell, and then you'll be coming right off the holidays. But I would love for Mitch McConnell to be a minority leader as opposed to the position that he's in now.
Thank you so much. No, that was, yeah, I mean, it's again, from a European standpoint, there seems to be a lot of attention on Georgia. So in some ways, it's unfathomable that people won't go out and vote. But I also understand, looking at the local conditions, that it can be quite distractive and people might deter from that. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. I think I certainly came away from looking at the United States with a different eye, that moving forward, I want to, we really have to pay attention to the diversity that we see within the country, not only racially and ethnically, but also socioeconomically, but then also urban and rural. And Raumesh, it was wonderful to have you there to remind us of local conditions that are often very, very different than the national conditions that we see more often in the sort of the broader newspaper. And Amanda, thank you so much for sharing your insights, having observed US Congress and national politics for many years. And thank you to our listeners for sending in questions. And we look forward to welcome you all back next year. Happy holidays. Thank you again.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Happy holidays.